You will always find friends here and champagne at our expense. I hope this charming woman did not have to suffer later as a collaboratrice. Further replacements had arrived from home, including the new commander of the battalion, Major Riederer von Paar, who had taken part in the First World War and soon gained our confidence. I took over my Num 3 company again, which had been led so well by Sergeant Almus. Lieutenant von Poschinger came to the company as a new platoon leader. I found time to enlarge my collection of French wines and cognacs. In vineyards north of Bordeaux, some of them very small, I bought bottles with a scarcity value which would never come on the market. My collection of old Burgundies, cognacs and armagnacs, some in mouth-blown bottles and with handwritten labels, had now grown to nearly 1,000 bottles, which I was anxious to send to Germany at the first opportunity. In January 1941, the division was transferred to Germany, to the area west of Bonn. The French chapter was now finally closed. Left behind were reserve units, a swelling military administration, the secret state police, with its reign of terror. My company was billeted in the village of Heimersheim, I myself in a moated manor house from the 15th century, which belonged to Baron von Boeselager, whose sons were also army officers. In the evening, when I returned from strenuous exercises in the field, we often sat together and discussed the situation. Old Boeselager was no follower of Hitler's. He was afraid that the next encounter with Britain could lead to disaster. While we talked, the old Baroness sat near us and played Patience Solitaire. She encouraged me to try it too because it was so soothing. To please her, I let her show me 2 varieties and found the game by no means so boring and old ladyish. When I left, she gave me a pack of cards. They were to be a great help to me later in the recovery of my inner peace in critical situations. My young officers used to say at such times, the boss is playing patience and does not want to be disturbed. So things cannot be too bad. Even today I still like to play my soothing patience. At this juncture I tried to sum up the course of the war so far, and consider how it might and should continue. In 2 blitzkriegs, Poland and France had been defeated, Denmark, Norway, and Belgium had been occupied. Until the alarming news from the North African theatre of war, the Mediterranean area too had seemed to be under control. The Wehrmacht, however, had to release considerable forces to secure all the territories, especially against a possible invasion by the British at some unforeseeable place. We still had our back free through the non-aggression pact with Stalin, which had been bought with territorial concessions in Poland and the Baltic. But how could Britain be defeated, who was being supported to an increasing degree by America, whose air attacks on the Reich had started, and who had retained supremacy at sea? In the long conversations with Baron von Boeselager, in which we looked for a way in which the war might be brought to an end, we found none. We both feared that this war, which had begun so hopefully, would probably last for a long time yet. At the beginning of February 1941, we were told that Rommel was being sent by Hitler to North Africa. The situation in Tripolitania had become so critical that we were being forced to go to the help of the Italians. Rommel spent a short leave with his family and then had no time left to say goodbye to us. On the 12th of February 1941, he flew to Rome and by the 14th had arrived in Tripoli, where he personally supervised the disembarkation of the 1st German unit, the elite 3rd Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, which I knew well from my time in Potsdam. We were very sorry to have lost Rommel and met our new divisional commander, General Freiherr von Funk, with some doubts. He was the opposite of Rommel, a general staff officer of the old school, no trooper like Rommel. He led from behind, from his command post, and did not, like Rommel, seek contact with his men. All the same, we unit leaders managed to adapt to him, the more so since he made no attempt to restrict us in our mobility. The weeks and months went by. The usual routine began, field exercises with imposed complications, training, and the integration of replacements. The war at the time was taking place elsewhere. From army bulletins, we heard of Rommel's success in North Africa, of his unconventional, and for the British, unexpected, thrust to the east and the recapture of Cyrenaica. We heard of the increasingly heavy air attacks on Germany. These depressed us most. So now, in contrast to the First World War, the civilian population too was being drawn into the war. We were anxious about our families. Hitler made angry speeches, his propaganda minister Goebbels called for the final victory, and the Jews were pilloried as friends. Of their fate, we heard nothing. In April 1941, I received a short leave, half of which I spent with my parents, but I no longer felt happy at home. My brother was in action with his whaler somewhere off Norway. My sister was cramming for the emergency abitur. My stepfather was suffering from an incurable intestinal cancer and being cared for devotedly by my mother. He could not come to terms with modern warfare and was always making comparisons with the First World War. We were at odds with each other more and more. The other half of my leave I spent in my beloved Paris. There, J.B. Morel and Clement Duart prophesied again that the British, alone or with the support of the Americans, would win. In their view, Germany had nothing to set against the inexhaustible material of the British and Americans, especially since in Germany, industrial areas and communication routes were exposed ever more frequently to air attack. I argued against them, but did not know either how we could win the war. I then returned to my company, and the fame old round began again, which is enervating in the long run. The inhabitants frequently asked us what was supposed to happen next. There was great bewilderment. Only one thing was certain: initial euphoria had given way to sober judgment. I wanted to get my collection of bottles into a safe place and asked Baron von Boeselager if I could leave them with him. But of course, I will sink them in the moat with my own collection. No one will think of looking there. Later, in Russia, I had a letter from von Boeselager. He had borrowed 2 bottles of champagne from my stock for his daughter's wedding. He should have taken them all. At the end of the war, the hiding place was discovered by the French occupation troops. The sales Boche stole our wine and cognac. "Everything really belongs to us," said the French, as Boeselager told me later. That was the end of my dream of a French wine collection. At the beginning of June, suddenly and without warning, our division was entrained in Bonn, and after a journey of 2 or 3 days, detrained in Insterburg in East Prussia. The battalion was billeted in the surrounding villages. I used the opportunity to visit some friends on an estate nearby, where some years before, gay and light of heart, I had celebrated the wedding of one of my comrades. The old woman, who after the death of her husband, now managed the estate alone, greeted me sadly. "How depressing to see you again in these circumstances. How contented we were then, and now we are threatened with a long and difficult encounter with Russia. Do you understand it all? What more does Hitler want? The Lebensraum so often talked of by him and Rosenberg. We walked through the clean stables. It was like saying goodbye to the old Germany. After a meal, my hostess asked me, 'Please play something on the piano. Something lively. Please, it has got to be something for me to remember.' So I sat there by candlelight and played whatever came into my head. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. As I took my leave, her last words were, 'Goodbye, may God protect you.' Today, her estate is part of Poland. Unfortunately, I do not know what became of her. A warm, late spring lay over East Prussia. I thought back to my years as a recruit, to Königsberg, the old knight's castle of Marienburg, and the Masurian lakes. I had grown fond of that little patch of earth with its dry summers and very cold winters with heavy falls of snow. I admired the people who had come there with the Teutonic Knights at the beginning of the 13th century, and in the course of the centuries, through conflicts with Poland, Sweden, and Russia, and not least through the climate, had grown into a tough race. The hospitality of the East Prussians was famous, their dry humour notorious. The wide expanse of East Prussia was a preview of how things would look in Russia. What did Hitler have in mind? The entry into Russia seemed certain. The mass of the Wehrmacht was concentrated on the eastern frontier. This showed that it would not be a matter of a limited operation to bring home to the Reich the Baltic provinces, which had once been occupied by the Teutonic Knights. Would Hitler declare the non-aggression pact with Russia to be null and void? How would he try to explain this to the people? Goebbels' propaganda machine was going full strength. There was talk once more of subhumans, of Lebensraum, which had to be secured for the German race, and once again, popular opinion was successfully turned around 180 degrees. The eve of our entry arrived. We were in a strange frame of mind. The vast Russian Empire was hidden, as though by a curtain. The huge distances were beyond our mental grasp. The Ural Mountains, which were nearly 2,000 miles away, were merely the end of the European part. Behind them lay the start of the endless expanse of Siberia. We thought of the fate of Napoleon, whose victorious army had foundered in the extent and cold of Russia. We were not actually afraid, but neither were we sure of what our attitude should be toward an opponent whose strength and potential were unknown to us and whose mentality was completely alien. The euphoria of the past months had given way to a rather sober view. Even the young ones, who in the years since 1933 had gone through the school of National Socialism, and who had been sworn into the Hitler Youth in the name of their Führer, had now fallen silent. They doubted that Russia could be defeated with idealism alone. Would we be able to cope with a second front, as a result of which the first front in the West would be held mainly by reserve divisions? Would Britain be able to exploit the weak spot? In spite of all our doubts and questions, we did what soldiers have done in every age. We set our minds on the present and were ready to do our duty. At 4 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1941, the German Wehrmacht crossed the border into Russia. The Luftwaffe made mass attack on airfields and railway junctions. On that morning, trains carrying Russian goods were still trundling over the frontier, delivering commodities under the terms of the Non-Aggression Pact. A few days earlier, I had been summoned to my divisional commander, General von Funk-Luck. You are being attached to 7th Divisional HQ with immediate effect and appointed as my adjutant. I was reluctant. General, I do not like leaving my company at this vital moment. Could not you find someone else? No, he replied. The adjutant I asked for has not arrived yet. Besides, we have already lost too many company commanders and are likely to lose a lot more. To that extent, I regard you in a way as a reserve commander. Gritting my teeth, I said goodbye to my battalion commander and to my men. With Erich Beck and the faithful Mercedes, I reported to Divisional HQ. The German troops, with the panzers in the lead, advanced along the whole front and swept over the weak Russian border guards. The Russians seemed to have been utterly surprised by our entry, though our troop concentrations could not have escaped them. Our superiority in the air was quite obvious, both in quantity and in quality. It soon became clear that the Russian Air Force had only obsolete machines at its disposal, but above all that the pilots did not function nearly as well as our fighter and dive bomber pilots, or the pilots of our Western opponents. This was naturally a great relief to us, and when Russian aircraft appeared, we hardly bothered to take cover. We often had to smile, in fact, when for want of bombs, thousands of nails rained down on us from their bomb bays. We soon came to realize that neither war at sea nor war in the air was suited to the Russian mentality. In the course of her history, Russia had waged war mostly on land and had recruited her army from her rural millions. Russia had never been a sea power to be taken seriously, and her cumbersome military bureaucracy had obviously never given much thought to building up a modern air force. In exchange, however, we very soon had to accustom ourselves to her almost inexhaustible masses of land forces, tanks and artillery. Our Panzer Corps thrust first to the northeast. Its goal was the city of Vilnius, in what was formerly Lithuania. The resistance we encountered was comparatively slight, but already in evidence were the first T-34 tanks, later to become famous, which formed the backbone of the Russian tank force. The T-34 was an uncomplicated construction. Its armor plates were welded crudely together. Its transmission was simple, everything without any great frills or finesse. Damage was easy to repair. In addition, the Russians were masters of improvisation. Thousands upon thousands of the T-34 were produced, in factories that lay beyond the reach of our Luftwaffe. Vilnius was enveloped to the north and south, and captured. We were at once turned east, in the direction of Minsk. As divisional adjutant, many jobs fell to me that were far from being to my taste. It is true I sat in the CO staff car every evening and learned something of our plans and actions, which General von Funk explained with the help of maps spread out on his table. Though no less efficient, his style of leadership was nevertheless quite different from that of Rommel. I was sent by the divisional commander, more and more often, as liaison officer to the various units, especially when our communications broke down. We had now reached an area that was typical of the Russian landscape, vast forests and steppes, and roads that we would not even designate as country lanes. After brief downpours of rain, they turned into muddy tracks, which were only passable in some places after engineers or offloaded grenadiers had felled trees to make a wooden runway with the trunks. It was not so much our opponents that held up our advance as the catastrophic roads. In this impassable terrain, we lost touch one day with our motorcycle battalion. The divisional commander was afraid that it might have been cut off. Luck, You were always hankering after something other than desk work. Our motorcycle battalion is not reporting. It must be about here. He showed me the spot on the map. Try and make contact with them and give me an account of the situation. But take care. In this great wooded area, there may still be Russians all over the place. I had only my Mercedes available and set off with Eric Beck. Without contact with the enemy, but with considerable difficulty on account of the barely passable tracks, I reached the indicated area and did, in fact, find the battalion there. Everything is okay here, I was told, but we seem to have penetrated some Russian units like a Tom without their full realization. It might be as well if division could free us from this situation. As soon as the Russians know we were here, things won't look too good for us. I promised to report everything to the divisional commander and ask for immediate help. I drove back along the same track. Beside me sat Eric K. with his machine pistol at the ready. After a few kilometers through dense forest, we came to a clearing. Both sides of the track were full of Russians. They recognized us at once, and I saw them bring their guns to the ready. It was another 30 yards before the track curved away again into the dense woods. Beck, duck down and fire to the right and behind me to the left, I shouted, crouched as low as I could at the wheel and pressed the accelerator. The first bullets were already whistling past us, inaccurately, however, since Beck had forced the Russians into cover by his bursts of fire. Our Mercedes cabriolet, which had certainly never been designed for Russian roads, jolted and bounced over the undue rating ground. One shot did strike the car, but caused no great damage. Thanks, Beck, and thanks to our car. We certainly had some luck there. I reported to the divisional commander, who smiled at me over his reading glasses and said, "Well, you wanted a taste of adventure. What more could you ask for? Thanks for your report at any rate. I will have something done at once for the relief of the motorcycle battalion." We gradually recognized the Russian tactics. They allowed themselves to be overrun, so that they could then, in small groups in our rear, attack our supply lines and following infantry. We learned from prisoners that Hitler's regrettable order, that all commissars were to be killed at once, had turned out to be a boomerang. The Russian reaction had been as simple as it was effective. The commissars, political officers allocated to each unit to keep an eye on the morale of the troops and their commanders, knew of Hitler's order. So they kept their men in check by telling them, "If you fall into German captivity, you will be killed at once. If you take just one step back, we will kill you." This explained why so many Russians, usually supplied with only a ration of dry bread, allowed themselves to be overrun. But they would not surrender, and formed the basis for the ever-growing partisan activity. An essential factor was that Stalin, knowing of the Russians' love of their country, declared the war to be a great patriotic war. It was not Nazi versus communist. We Germans were the attackers destroying the Russian homeland. They were the defenders of Mother Russia. Our aerial reconnaissance reported large concentrations of troops west of Minsk and around it, the first large town in Russia east of the former Polish frontier. Our division was to thrust past Minsk to the north and cut off the Russians' retreat to the east. Another panzer corps was to thrust past to the south of the city. The vanguard was made up of the reconnaissance battalion and the motorcycle escorts. Minsk was enveloped in a pincer movement, the first pocket was closed, and a large number of prisoners were taken. Our infantry, whose inhuman hardships made us feel sorry for them, followed up on foot and took care of the surrounded Russians. The panzer divisions were at once thrown into action for a further advance to the east. Again we had to fight our way forward through forests and along wretched roads. For our division, the goal was Vitebsk, a town that lay north of the feeder road Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow. We constantly met with resistance, but the Russians lacked any organized opposition. Our advance had been too rapid for our opponents to have had time to construct effective lines of defense. It looked very like another blitzkrieg. For the first time in our advance, we came into contact with the local population. We passed through typical Russian villages, in which wooden houses were ranged on either side of the country lane. Each included a village church. The churches without exception had been converted into warehouses, but most of them had been plundered. The sparsely furnished houses had a large clay oven in the center, on which, in winter, the whole family slept. Below it stood the oven bench, and in front of that a wooden table. In a corner of the room a candle burned, over which hung one or more icons, sacred pictures. In the middle of the village, one found a sauna, which was indispensable for all Russians since washing facilities in the houses were almost non-existent. Directly linked to the house was a shed for a few cows, which a peasant was allowed to keep for his own use, in addition to a small parcel of land for the cultivation of potatoes and maize for his daily needs. Otherwise, the inhabitants worked on the state kolkhoz or sovkhoz, a kind of village or state cooperative. There, it was a matter of fulfilling the norm, the measure of all purely state concerns. The condition of the village streets was even worse than that of the roads we had to traverse so far, for here, in addition, the ground had been churned up by the little panny horses drawing the farm carts. Here, there was nothing to requisition in order to improve the diet of the troops. On the contrary, we gave the women and children chocolate and cigarettes from our ration. As divisional adjutant, I found time and opportunity to make contact with local people, in the course of which my knowledge of Russian came in useful. I was astonished to detect no hatred among them. Women often came out of their houses with an icon held before their breast, crying, "We are still Christians. Free us from Stalin who destroyed our churches." Many of them offered an egg and a piece of dry bread as a welcome. We gradually had the feeling that we really were being regarded as liberators. The hot summer was beginning in Russia. It was often broken by heavy downpours of rain, which forced us to take shelter for the night in the houses. Whenever possible, we preferred our vehicles as night quarters, or the ditches beside the road, since we were afraid of vermin. Vitebsk, like Minsk, was also skirted widely to the north and south. A new, smaller pocket was formed, the elimination of which we again left to the infantry, who had so far only marched and not yet seen any real action. Then the message reached us that Major Riederer von Paar, the commander of the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, had fallen. General von Funk called me in. "Luck, your work with me has been shorter than I expected. You will take over the Recce Battalion at once. I will have you confirmed as its commander. Thanks for everything." "Good luck," I called my aide. "Beck, we were off to the front again. Get the Mercedes ready and pack our things." We were driving to the battalion as quickly as possible. That very evening, we received our combat orders, advanced to the east in the direction of Smolensk. Our Panzer Corps, under General Hoth, approaching from the northwest, and another Panzer Corps from the southwest, would attack and seek to destroy strong Russian forces reported to be west of Smolensk and around it. My battalion was to form the spearhead and reconnoiter to the east and northeast. We moved out the following morning. We came upon Russian stragglers, who were usually quick to surrender. Word had got around, it seemed, that prisoners would not be shot by us. We made good progress, and just west of Smolensk, struck a wide trail that was not shown on our maps. We soon discovered that the Russians had laid out this trail from Moscow to Minsk as a future highway. As we found out later, it had already been paved with asphalt west of Moscow. This trail became an aid to orientation during the rest of our advance. Before long, we met with fairly strong resistance, so we veered away to the northeast. The encirclement of Smolensk was literally there on offer. Within a few days, with the help of our air force, we enveloped Smolensk from the north and south and formed a huge pocket in which there were said to be over 100,000 Russians threatened with capture. With my reinforced battalion, I held and closed the Smolensk-Moscow trail. We were only 400 kilometers from Moscow. We were given a few days' rest, one of which I used to go to a makeshift collecting camp that had been set up near Smolensk. In it were penned thousands of Russian prisoners in a closely packed space with no protection from the hot sun or the torrential showers of rain. They seemed apathetic, their faces without expression. Their uniforms, which were simple but practical, were dull and further emphasized the impression of a grey mass. Because of the danger of lice, their heads had been loose-cropped. They seemed resigned to their fate, for since time immemorial they had only known oppression. Whether it was the Tsar, Stalin or Hitler, oppression remained oppression. In a pouch, they carried their iron ration, dry bread. Later, even we would learn to treasure it. Many of them called out to me for soda, water. They seemed to be suffering severely from thirst. Our services behind the lines had not been prepared for so many prisoners. With the best intentions in the world, they were quite unable to look after them and evacuate them quickly. Nor were things much better for the Russian officers. They, too, lay about apathetically. Now and again, someone would start up one of those Russian songs that reveal a corner of the Russian soul. I felt sorry for them, for they too were human beings like ourselves. In contrast, however, to the way Russians might appear to a foreigner, we also got to know another side of them. They were like children who could tear the wings off a fly one minute, and in the next, cry over a dead bird. They might share their last crust of bread one moment, and then hit the same person over the head. They fought with what they had. Once we came to an abandoned village. A dog ran up to us. He wagged his tail and whimpered. When we tried to stroke him, he crawled under an armoured vehicle. Suddenly we heard a bang, an explosion. The vehicle was damaged, but luckily failed to catch fire. We ran up to it, and discovered that the dead dog had had an explosive charge concealed in the fur of its back, with a movable pin as detonator. When the dog crawled, the detonator tipped over and triggered off the explosion. The dog had been trained to find meat under armoured vehicles. Unfortunately, from then we had to shoot all dogs that approached us. While the mass of Russian prisoners seemed to accept their fate as the will of God, our own fear of falling into Russian hands was great. We often heard the wounded say, "Please take me with you or else shoot me. I could not stand Russian captivity." Another day, I obtained permission to go to Smolensk to see the old city. I took along my orderly officer and 2 men as guard. Here, there was as yet practically no German occupation since the pocket had formed more to the west of the city and was now being mopped up by the infantry. Smolensk looked as though it had been abandoned. Destruction in the industrial quarters and of the bridges over the Dnieper was immense. In the midst of the ruins, Smolensk Cathedral pointed to the sky. It appeared largely unharmed. I followed the women and the old men, and as I entered the cathedral, was deeply impressed by its beauty. It looked intact. The altar was domed, burning candles and many icons richly embellished with gold bathed the interior in a festive light. As I went up to the altar with my companions, an old man, poorly dressed and with a flowing beard, spoke to me in broken German. "Господин officer, I am a pope who used to preach here before the Lenin-Stalin era. I have been in hiding now for many years, scraping a living as a shoemaker. Now you have liberated our city. May I say a first mass in this cathedral?" "How is it," I asked, "that your cathedral is in such good condition?" His answer surprised me. To America in Tsarist times bought the church and all its treasures. Immediately after the revolution, Russians who had emigrated from the Russians, who at the time were in urgent need of American dollars. The cathedral is American property, which is why everything is almost unchanged. I have never been able to verify his statement, but it was not very important to me. Without referring to HQ, I gave the Pope permission to celebrate Mass the next day, for which he wanted to bring in an additional Pope. The following day, I went to Smolensk again. Having informed the divisional commander in the meantime, as a precaution, I took along an armoured patrol. The sight that met our eyes when we arrived was breathtaking. The square in front of the cathedral was full of people moving slowly toward the entrance. With my orderly officer, I jostled my way forward. Already, there was not a corner left in the cathedral in which people were not standing, sitting, or kneeling. We remained standing to one side to avoid disturbing the service by our presence. I was not familiar with the Russian Orthodox ritual, but the ceremony that now began drew me more and more under its spell. Invisible behind the altar, one of the 2 popes began with a monotone chant, which was answered by a choir of 8 voices standing in front of the altar. The chanting of the precentor and the choir filled the vast space of the church. The acoustics gave the impression that the chanting came from above, from heaven. The people fell on their knees and prayed. All had tears in their eyes. For them, it was the first Mass for more than 20 years. My companion and I were greatly moved. How deep must the faith have been of these poor, oppressed people? No ideology, no compulsion or terror had been able to take it from them. It was an experience I shall never forget. Our next goal was a town called Vyazma, on the Smolensk-Moscow road, little more than 200 kilometers from Moscow. With the reconnaissance battalion, I was to put out feelers to the east and northeast on the northern side of the trail, reconnoiter our flank, and push forward as rapidly as possible. After about 50 kilometers, we encountered stiff resistance. We discovered that the Russians had set up a strong line of defense on the hills east of a wide valley, on a tributary of the Dnieper, a few kilometers north of the town of Yartsevo. anchored by T-34 tanks and heavy artillery. I reported the situation, and the division formed up for a full-scale attack. Fierce tank artillery duels broke out, which lasted for days. My birthday was 15 July, which I wanted to celebrate in some way or other, as it might be my last. Since we were stuck and unable to move, I invited my fellow commanders to a meal. My hotelier Prussia, from my own company, was given the job of conjuring something up. On the western hill, within sight of the Russians, lying some 1,000 yards away, a table was set up and decked with an assortment of delicacies. In the normal way, they would hardly have attracted attention, but here in Russia, they were rare. With an organized bottle of vodka and some bottles of Moselle, we drank to an uncertain future. The battles at Yartsevo lasted longer than we would have liked. The blitzkrieg seemed to be over. With considerable losses, we finally broke through. Unfortunately, among those who fell was the commander of our motorcycle battalion, and I now had to assume command of that too. Now I was even more the eyes and ears of the division, with 4 companies of motorized veteran soldiers under my command. Resistance grew stiffer and stiffer. The Russians now appeared with the T-50 tank, which was much better armed and armoured. To knock it out from the front, we had to use the 88mm guns. Vyazma remained our goal. Before that, we had to conquer the upper reaches of the Dnieper River. It was very hot in those August days, but the dry continental heat was quite bearable. It was a hardship only for the infantry following on foot. While the bulk of the division fought its way slowly forward, my job was to reconnoitre to the north and northeast on our open left flank. There was as yet no continuous front. The tank divisions had thrust forward like wedges and left their flanks exposed. We went through trackless terrain with few settlements and through never-ending forest. The roads were merely trails for horse-drawn carts. Once, when I was on foot looking for a route to get around a bridge that was impassable, I came face to face with a Russian soldier. He was standing by a tree and apparently intended us to overrun him. But then, as if in slow motion, I saw him raise his gun and take aim at me. Either, I thought, jerked up my machine pistol and was the first to fire. The Russian lost his gun and fell to the ground. When I got to him, he was still alive, but not for very long. I shall never forget his eyes. They were full of questioning. Why? Here it became clear to me for the first time that you or me was decisive. In this, there was no room for feelings. I thought only briefly that this young Russian too had a mother and family. I had to leave him there, as so many were left on both sides, with no one to care about them. After about 50 kilometers, we were out of the wooded area. We encountered no resistance. Before us was a little village, which we ventured slowly to approach. The inhabitants came out of their cottages. They seemed to take us for Russians. When I explained who we were, a little old woman came up to me. "Is it war?" she asked. "What's our little father doing, the Tsar?" It turned out that these people had remained unaware of the Russian Revolution, Stalin, and our war against Russia. Here, time seemed to have stood still. Here, there was no party functionary. We lingered on in the village for a few hours and tried to explain what had happened in the world since Russia had lost her star. As we left, I was given an icon as a present from the village elder, with the words, "Thank you for your understanding. Leave us to live in the future as we have in the past. May God preserve you." Our advance became ever slower and more difficult, the resistance ever stronger. The Russians were throwing against us their elite divisions from the Moscow area. Furthermore, the supply situation was also becoming increasingly critical.